Right.
Okay, welcome to our evidence briefing on metacognition and self-regulation. My name is Alan Ethorn. I'm an exec head and CPD research lead for Learn Academies Trust, and I'm joined today when working with Karen Robinson, who is Deputy Director of Lincolnshire Research School. And this evidence briefing video, we hope, will help to break down and go through this particular evidence briefing. As you see, there's an awful lot within it, and this video is not a definitive guide to absolutely everything in the evidence briefing, but hopefully we'll give you a summary of the key points. And also, we will make sure that you have there's lots of supplementary documents and resources that might help you with all of this as well. So just a quick reminder about what we do. So within the research network, you can see the map. That's where we are based in various places across the country. And we work to, alongside the EEF, to synthesize, to generate and mobilize this research and this information to help support schools and help them to be evidence informed. Speaking of which, so when we talked about evidence informed practice, we're talking about understanding and being aware of what evidence is out there, but most importantly, adding into that our own professional expertise. And that's how we sort of define what evidence-informed practice looks like. And it helps us to make those best bets as school leaders about things that we might want to do, and also what things we might want to stop doing as well. And that's where these evidence briefings are help to kind of go through that document, or the different documents that we produce to support leaders in schools. If you're watching this video having not signed up to it yourself initially, if you could just take a moment to scan the QR code, fill in the details, it helps us just to capture the engagement data and where people are accessing this video from. So why metacognition? So you'll all hopefully be aware of the EEF toolkit and know how that works. And you can see there that metacognition and self-regulation appears to be that has can have, obviously depends on how it's delivered and what's done, and hopefully that will help with that today, can have a big impact on outcomes for children. There's a fairly good, the locks there on the picture there's a fairly good set of evidence that suggests that this is pretty secure, the evidence. And as a school leader, particularly this time of year with budgets, in theory, it's a relatively cheap thing to do. So in terms of having impact, it's high impact, low cost, which is always a really good thing. So hopefully this video will help go through some of the nuances of what we mean. And so this is what the guidance report looks like, and on the left there you can see these are the bits, the different areas of this. So some of it thinking about metacognition, some of it about cognition, and some of it about motivation, and how those things are linked and how they appear. So within the guidance report, there are 7 recommendations, and you can see them there. As always, each recommendation, although that's a summary kind of statement, have lots of information underneath all of those. So some of them will go into a bit more detail than others. Some, for example, like recommendation 7 talks about professional development and implementation, which is something that we have extra videos on, and there's further guidance reports on. So we won't go into too much detail with that today. So I shall pass you over to Karen, who's going to talk through the first 2 recommendations in this evidence briefing.
Thank you, Alan. So we've joined these together because they really do link, in that you can't do number 2, which is explicitly teach the metacognitive strategies, until your teachers understand what they really are. So what we're going to do is sort of join them together with a little bit of explanation. So the first thing here is actually a really good pause point to actually discuss, if you're using this in a staff meeting, what is cognition, what's that understanding, what is the understanding of metacognition, and how do we motivate our pupils, and maybe in terms of extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. Our main focus for this evidence briefing, after you've had that discussion, will be all about metacognition. So having a look first at metacognition, we're going to be talking through the planning, monitoring and evaluation aspect of that. That's the regulation, but also the metacognitive knowledge, such as knowledge of the task, knowledge of strategies and knowledge of the self. And all of these 6 things work together. So just have a little look at some definitions. The cognition simply is that knowledge you know, and those strategies and those memorization techniques. But that metacognition is really how you're controlling your own thinking, how you can self-monitor, and how can you deploy at your right time. And that is something that really takes time to be taught and to be understood. And then that motivation, and that is the willingness to engage in something challenging rather than just thinking, I can't do that. How do we get there? We'll start to talk a little bit more about independent learning to get to that process, that place. Another definition I just added is this one. I think often we talk about metacognition is thinking about learning, or how we learn. So it's how to, again, plan, monitor and evaluate our own learning. Just put this in because I thought it was a really nice example of each of those. So we've got that cognition, so you've been taught really those phoneme patterns, those mnemonics, and that metacognition is then using that knowledge to plan and to manage, monitor and evaluate. And the motivation comes from engaging in that repeated practice, and that also perseverance, drawing challenge and thinking about different ways from your understanding that you can apply that knowledge, and asking those questions, which will come a little bit later. So you would have seen this in the guidance report, and it has that cognition. So we've got our task written there, and that is simply to translate the words into equation. But to do that, lots of things will be happening, and there'll be some questions that are being asked. It's almost what's happening inside your head in that planning. What do you need to think about? What do you know already? And as you're going along that monitoring, has it improved my task? Is it helping me? And then that evaluation at the end. But at the same time, there'll be the metacognition of knowledge of yourself and of the task and of those strategies, which we'll go into a little bit more detail later. This is a really useful tool, particularly when you're doing those think aloud and you're modeling that metacognition process, which we'll talk about more. And just those plannings that is to be teaching your students, you know, have you seen this before? What strategies, what resources do I need? Very useful sort of in maths think alouds as well. And then as you go along that monitoring, and the bit that often gets missed out is the evaluating, and how can we do that, and how can we get that into our learning? So one thing I'd recommend is having a look at this tool. So now going back a little bit more into that metacognitive knowledge. And these are also some useful questions there. And that is that understanding and knowledge of the task. Is it too challenging? And how do we stop students going, well, yes, it is, and just stopping there? So that's then looking into more detail about what are the most difficult aspects of the task. You know, what is the time I should devote to this or less time? What are the bits I know I can do straight away? What are the easy bits? So again, just getting that into your teaching, knowledge of yourself as well, you know, your motivation or not, how long can you keep yourself focused? And this is quite good for those SEND children, understanding their own learning, and then those knowledge of the strategies, which we're going to come into more detail when we get onto recommendation 3. And those knowledge of those strategies just highlighted here, which you would have seen. Just give you a minute to look at those before we go into our next recommendation.
Great, thanks, Karen. Yes, so as Karen mentioned there, so the next couple of recommendations go into some of those in a little bit more detail. So recommendation 3, as you can see there, it says model your own thinking to help pupils develop their metacognitive and cognitive skills. So as a teacher, it's that being aware of what we're modeling and how we're doing things, and using that as part of our teaching, which sounds obvious and it seems like, well, of course, but I think sometimes this is where I found, certainly as, you know, in teaching, that sometimes actually when as a primary school practitioner, you're faced with teaching something that perhaps you're not an expert in, and having to kind of really think through that process almost becomes easier to do that with the children and to model those things with the children. And you can see the analogy there that, you know, as we suggest, all teachers use modeling to some extent. That's, you know, we do, that's how we teach. But being aware of how we use it and being kind of precise with how we use it, that's that kind of metacognitive bit to kind of model how we do. So within the SEN guidance report, as Karen mentioned earlier, that there's a really useful resource talk which is here about a 5-a-day principle, about what high quality teaching kind of can look like, and it's being aware of all of these things and how are they used. So you know, how's explicit instruction used? How are, as we're talking about, cognitive and metacognitive strategies used? How's scaffolding used? Flexible grouping, using technology. So they're part of that kind of diet, as you will, for all pupils, and particularly those with SEND. So we're just going to focus in on a couple of those. Obviously today, the 2 and 3, in terms of those cognitive and metacognitive strategies, and also then the scaffolding as well. So thinking about when we are modelling or when we're working in class, obviously there are different things that we might be doing as a teacher, i.e. where the teacher is talking or thinking or sharing, and you can see where there are different activities that happen during a lesson where you know, someone has, it's more on the teacher than it is on the pupils, and vice versa. So you can see there, for example, kind of modeling a learned strategy that's quite highly kind of teacher focused, and obviously children listening and things. But as we move through into kind of structured reflections, independent practice, and things, that the onus comes back onto the students. And so thinking about how do we design this so that that actually does happen, and that independent work doesn't then just become more teacher talking through, which sometimes is a thing that we can see with the guidance report on effective use of teaching assistants, that sometimes get too wrapped up in completing a task as opposed to actually thinking through what's going on and doing that, and the independent practice kind of never happens. So within the document, this is a useful kind of, it goes into a bit more detail here about how that might look from a metacognitive point of view. And you can see that, you know, that taking the independent practice bit, for example, pupils completing the task by themselves without support. It's that thing of, have I done enough as a teacher to make sure that that's possible? You know, if I've really badly modeled something, or really badly scaffolded, or really badly planned something that children just can't access, they're not going to be able to do it by themselves. So it, you know, comes back to that kind of planning process. And it's sort of thinking along this sort of the process of, you know, starting with the teacher sort of doing the most work, as it were, then sort of reducing that, and then it's sort of being more balanced, and then moving on, obviously, then to the pupil taking ownership of it by removing those scaffolds as we go through. And that might be within a lesson, it could be over a sequence of lessons, or over a year. So it's not saying, you know, every lesson looks like this necessarily, or not, but it could do, or it should do, in terms of a teaching sequence as well over a period of time, which feeds nicely into what you've probably come across is the kind of I do, we do, you do way of thinking. And so, you know, when as a teacher I'm doing, it's that, not just I'm doing it in silence at the front, well, it might be, but kind of not just I've done it, but how am I going to show how I'm doing it? You know, how do I model? What questions am I kind of modeling that I'm asking myself, as Karen was saying? How am I thinking through that. What am I almost explicitly showing that I'm kind of doing that? Is that a good thing to do here? Should I do this, or should I be thinking of another strategy? Or where are the easy bits to start? Or where shall I start? Or I'm stuck here. Maybe I need to do this, and sort of sharing that as that's what's going on in your head or our heads before moving on to the kind of that we do work, and then the kind of obviously then moving the students sort of carrying that baton on then for that independent practice. And so just sort of take a moment really to think about how many different types of modelling that you can name and think about that you use. And then in terms of cognitive load, which Karen will talk about in a moment, thinking about modelling that, as I mentioned, doesn't increase cognitive load by being too much. So if you're modelling, I don't know, say for example, I don't know, long division, the first time you've ever done, child's ever come across that. If you're going into that, you model it once, small, at the front of the class somewhere where no one can see what you're doing, and just have an answer. Is that going to help? Or equally, if you're trying to go through all the steps in one go without the children, without stopping and pausing, is that a good way of doing it? Classic one about telling time is about how telling a time on an analog clock. If you're jumping straight to doing minutes and things like that, is what's come before that to make sure that children understand about the hour hand and things first, and all of those kind of things. And again, this is just a useful resource there to help sort of think about that kind of high quality teaching and the sort of modelling and what we could use, the ways we could do that modelling. And equally, that classic kind of teacher modelling of, oh, I think something's wrong here. What have I done wrong? And thinking through that process or sharing that process, demonstrating that process of, oh yeah, that can't be right because, and those kind of things. So one of those examples is the use of worked examples might be used to model. So just giving you some examples, I'm not going to go through them, but if you were trying to solve these questions, how would you go about it? Or the first thing I would do is this. I've noticed that, oh, it's this. So I know from what I've done before is if we find 10% of a number, that could be the first step. Can anyone remember how we do the first step of finding 10%? How do we do it? And those kind of things. And you might sort of talk and work those through. So, for example, in math situations, and again, some other examples where this time with those faded examples where you're kind of just slightly changing what needs to be done. So in this case, the kind of the equation is still the same. But the sort of elements are slightly different. So, for this one, I've done this and I've modeled how I've listed what I know. What about this one? What would we do for this one? How would we do it? So you can see there's a couple of lines which need filling in. So that might be the kind of faded example that then, the children would use that to add those bits based on what you'd modeled previously and how you knew those kind of things. And as it mentions in there about the use of examples and non-examples, diagrams and drawing and things like that to help explain those things to make them make sense. I think that's often one of the hardest things in teaching, isn't it? That when you know things, it's easy to presume everybody understands it or can imagine the picture that you've got in your head, and they might not have. So that might help think through modelling, and also those kind of use of non-examples of, no, that's not orbiting, that's different, and those kind of things that you'll be aware of and have used. And again, as we mentioned, one of those 5-a-day principles about scaffolding, there's a really useful document and resource there that kind of goes through that of what those scaffolds could look like, and some of those might be verbal scaffolds, some of them might be written scaffolding to kind of help and to support, and with the idea that you're helping to move that kind of, as we mentioned there, with that there might be more help or less help to sort of with those scaffolds to enable children to be doing some of this independently. So if they're self-scaffolding or prompting, you know, those things are kind of, the pupils kind of, there's greater independence there. Whereas if it's all done by the adult, then they're not necessarily doing that thinking for themselves. Someone else is doing that thinking, and ultimately they're going to get to another question and still not be too sure. So that, again, is worth looking at and considering. And you'll have come across the Freya model as well for graphic organisers to help some of this, to think about, you know, what it is, where do we find it, any examples that are not, those kind of misconceptions that come up, and thinking along those lines as well. And as I mentioned, you know, different other graphic organisers that can help through that process and thinking through, and helping when we're modelling to kind of model the process that we know that's in our head, but helping the children to sort of see that and to help them in that process. And as mentioned, just a final slide there about, final slide there about visual scaffolds, what they look like, about verbal scaffolds and how they can be used, and then the written scaffolds and how they can be used, and some really good sort of questions there to kind of to think about how you use them in your school. Was there anything else, Karen, on those two areas I've forgotten?
No, there's a lot there to be thought
Yes.
about. So lots of pause points. I think this is really interesting, and some questions to discuss in your settings. The only thing I would say is the 7-step model is just something to really take away as a key thing from this, as a starting to be thinking about in your school, how you're doing those things. Is there anything you do particularly well? How do you activate prior knowledge? Is something that's quite tricky. Do you have time to reflect? Is that memorization part there, and how you're doing it? So just to review that, think it through, think about your strength as a school and the bits that you might want to work on, and then maybe that's something you could focus on.
Fab. So Karen, back to you.
Okay, so now we're just thinking about how to set that appropriate level of challenge to develop pupils' self-regulation and metacognition. This is not easy to get right. So I'm just going to let you think through some things. So if I was to show you this, in your mind, you would already be starting to think of processes linked to your knowledge of yourself, knowledge of where you've experienced this before. Probably you're feeling quite calm about this, and you're thinking about the strategies to work out your answer. Then, if I showed you this, how does that make you feel? And what are you doing? Now, mathematicians among you may have already been thinking of strategies to do this. Non-mathematicians or people with thinking knowledge of the self, so me, might be going, I'm not even going to attempt this or think about this. What would you do? Will you go through that? Do you just get to go to your phone? Do you get a calculator? Do you approximate? So these are all strategies, metacognitive, but also start to link about, understand that we talked about that knowledge of yourself, and how do you get that challenge just right so that the pupil can have a go and not just say, I can't do this, linking to everything they've already learned before, and that plan, that evaluation, and that monitoring. So this is just an interesting exercise for you to think through. And this all links to the working memory. I'm sure you've seen this sort of many times before. So you've got that input coming in, but the first thing you've got to have that sensory memory. So what's happening around you? How can you get that focus in the first bit? How can you stop those distractions in the room? And then when you've got the attention, you've got your working memory. Now, as you know, the working memory is a limited space, and if it's overloaded, you're going to forget more. very quickly. You just haven't got there. So what we're trying to do is get all of that information into that long-term memory so it can be retrieved to support that working memory. And as you can see from that model, we've got that encode and that retrieval that we talk about all the time to get that into that long-term memory. And just thinking about in your curriculum design, where is that retrieval happening and how are you visiting? As you can see on this diagram, it's that rehearsal all of the time, that coming back. And in each of the stage, there will be forgetting, but particularly that beginning, that sensory, in that working memory, there's going to be more forgetting. So it's just making sure you've got that in place in your planning. And then this comes to here, just that managing that load. What we really want to be is mirroring that extrinsic load. That's what's happening around us, making sure we're getting the intrinsic information into our long-term memory. So be short first into long. So it's just that extrinsic load. It's just thinking even how you use your PowerPoints. Is there too much information? Are you showing one slide and then expecting your pupils to remember what was on that there, be going on to the next? What's happening in the room around you? So how can you minimize that to really focus and get that information, that intrinsic load, so we can get it into maximizing that load into the long-term memory? And there are lots of blogs which I'll add at the end just on how we can do that, just to check there's not too much happening around the classroom. And just there's a lot about adaptive teaching at the moment, is just something I saw recently on Twitter. So there's quite a few examples here of just how we can think about reducing memory demands to help this. And in turn, this will also help getting that challenge just right. So just linking back to knowledge of the task, knowledge of self, and knowledge of the strategies. This is to a newspaper article. So we can start to see that. But going back to that maths knowledge task we mentioned before, if you don't feel strong in your mathematics, you might just stop straight away there. So it's how to make sure that you have been teaching your students, think about, what do I know before? What are the bits I recognise? What can help me do this? And that will link back to all of those questions we were talking about in that planning, that monitoring and evaluating. And this is a process that takes time to be built up and has to be taught for your think alouds. And it's quite interesting, how can I keep myself focused? There will be children that just minds are going up. So what strategy you got in place? What do they know? And then you've got all of these knowledge of the tasks, those prompts that are in place. So moving back to you, Alan. Anything you want to add on that one?
No, I think as you mentioned, it's that kind of just that awareness of the task and that link to not is it too much going, breaking down what we've done. It's that sort of small steps thing, isn't it? Of thinking, like I mentioned, I think it was Claire Seeley I heard many years ago talking about teaching time as a really good example of, if you break that down, and only because having taught year 3, 4, it used to always make me laugh, because you'd always try and attempt to teach time probably the last week before the holidays and things like that, and you try and cram it in a week or a couple of days, and actually, it's quite complicated. It's quite a complex task. You take for granted the fact that that when it's the hour hand, it's the hours, but when it's the minute hand, you're counting in fives, and then you've got to presume that children know how to count in fives, and there's all. The more you dig, you kind of realise then that's why it's quite so complicated, and we've all been there when the hour hand doesn't actually point to the 5, it points somewhere between the 5 and the 6, and it's that kind of, what does that mean, and understanding all of that. So I think it's it's that just taking time as teachers, isn't it, just to consider what it is in the busy world that we live in, that what's come before this and bits. But yeah. Okay, so recommendation 5 talks about the need, the sort of, to make sure that we promote and develop metacognitive talk in the classroom, which you can see as a result, what we've just mentioned, that learning talk and that teaching talk, and just how important that is to help with those discussions, instructions, and that kind of dialogue, and that kind of sort of talking our way through what we're doing and what we're doing, and kind of thinking through that process. So as always, there's some nice examples in there. So this is from the evidence briefing. So you might want to pause the video and to look at this. And so it's just modeling that kind of that talk of thinking through what did we do, what did we notice last time, why, oh, that didn't work, why might that change the answer then, what might happen, and just those purposeful kind of checking, seeing, and the kind of mistake bit of, or using mistakes or something, or there's misconceptions to kind of just to make sure that understanding's there, and that kind of, oh, can you explain why did you do, why do you think that then? Which leads nicely into what is not new, the kind of the idea of the concept cartoons, and that developing that oracy about, here's what some people think, what do you think? And going back to what Karen was saying, using sentence stems, which I'm sure we all do, are really helpful in that, breaking down that, rather than the children trying to focus on how do I put that into a sentence or as a response. It's well, we're going to use that I think pupil is right because, so all they're thinking about is which one they think is right or what they think, and that's where sort of sentence stems fit into this idea that they can really help. And it might be that you only have one of those sentence stems that, depending on what you've wanted to sort of elicit from people, from the children, that's there, then that makes the task kind of easier, and the concentration then is on what they're saying, what they think. And again, just I'll have a moment to kind of to look through. And again, it's that kind of just being aware. I mean, there you can see that sort of plan, monitor, and evaluate kind of questions to help us think through this of how's it going, what's it doing, how's it going, has it got better, has it got worse, those kind of things, and those examples to kind of help think through that and to sort of model that process, that metacognitive kind of process. And obviously the concept cartoons are an example of this. Another one here, example of that kind of reasoning. I know certainly in maths, since sort of the mastery maths approach has come in, that reasoning is really important. So not just the answer, I know the answer's this, but what else, I've noticed that, or the first thing we did, or how did you do it? How did you get there? Is that the best way of doing it? Yes, you did do, it's that classic, when they first learn how to do column subtraction, and they do those ones where 1,000 take away 999, and they do it all on a column, and they do all the partition and things like that, and it's like, no, that, yes, you've got the answer, but is that actually the best way of doing it? Is that the best strategy? Why was there a better strategy to use? And those kind of things. And back to you, Karen.
Thank you. So finally, after doing all of this work, what we're aiming for is to develop that independence through that whole school journey. So we worked on all of this until we get to that exams and the secondary. How are we going to get them to be able to independently study? How are we going to have that sort of that motivation to study when there's so many other things they could be doing instead? So let's have a little look. So just as a RAG rating, what we're looking for is this exemplary. I'll give you a chance to have a read. And just how we can do that. So maybe this is a pause point for you to discuss what you're doing in your schools, how that's going to work, how does that look? So again, another pause point. This is in the guidance report. And having a look at Nathan revising for his GCSEs. Having just had my daughter going for her GCSEs, I wish we'd had this. But how do you get there? What is he doing well? And how in your schools and your context have you worked through this so it's not just last minute? How do you teach these strategies? How do you build on these strategies? So just looking at those effective learners, some of those strategies are that how learning or knowing how to set those short-term goals, knowing how to make a revision plan, and all of this has to be taught and modelled. Thinking about attaining those goals. So some children also know how they learn. Some children use flashcards, and that's really useful, writing that down. Looking at those that progress, monitoring how they're getting on, using those past papers. Thinking about where it's best for them to revise, thinking about how they're going to have breaks, thinking about how long they should be revising for and when they should swap topics and things like that. That's a lot to be sort of taught and to understand. The inefficient strategies is that preferring to reread, not understanding how much they will forget, thinking they can just cram it the night before, not be knowing those strategies really. And often they think if they stay up as a teenager all night, they'll know it the next day. They don't understand that doesn't work and how the memory works and how to take time. I know this because I battled with it for quite a while in these conversations. So I just borrowed this slide from Dr. Nikki Kaiser, and I just thought it was a really lovely one as a self-reflection on her. And it's when we set those homeworks that just say, revise for the test next week on structure and bonding. Well, how? How do you do that? How do they know which piece of information? How do they know how to make those flashcards? How do they know how to revisit? What support has been put in place? And just a reflection really on what you're doing in your own context to do this, what needs to be developed, and if you're doing it well, what is it that makes it work? So this is from the guidance report, and it just is really interesting looking at those most effective learning techniques. And as you can see here, we've got that practice testing, self-testing, thinking about how they're spacing those practices, looking at an explanation and understanding why it's true or not, self-explanation, explaining, interleaving, summarising. But if you look at that bottom bit, often is that sort of highlighting and rereading, and that's not as effective. And this is another pause point really, just thinking about what you're doing in your school. Do your teachers understand it? What is the most effective? And are there any areas that you need to develop more? Or what do the students maybe find the hardest thing to do? This is just really thinking about what we've been saying. Students don't always understand this, and they might not assess things properly. So we're saying they might just try and cram. So it's them understanding how to plan and what to do and how we're going to put that in place. When you have these slides, you'll have time to come back and reread. So just to signpost you to some interesting reading about how we can develop that independent learning. And when we share this, we'll also be sharing lots of links and resources to support this. And that moves back to you, Alan.
Thanks, Karen. Yes, so the previous 6 recommendations in the guidance report go into detail about the metacognition side of things and self-regulation. And then the 7th one, which often, as those of you that have watched previous videos or other guidance reports will know, that the last one is often about, okay, so that's what we know, but how do we actually how do we support our teachers and staff to kind of to do these things and to know these things, and for this one, a couple of quotes there about about how important metacognition and cognitive load theory and things like that are. So if they're that important, how we factoring this into our school development plans, our CPD plans, how will we do these things? What are we going to do? So this is where I'll just briefly highlight the effective professional development guidance reports, and within there's lots of information, but the 4 kind of key areas are building knowledge. So how will we build our staff's knowledge of metacognition and self-regulation? And for that, there's 2 mechanisms. Thinking about, first one is about managing cognitive load. So we've covered a lot. Those 6 recommendations are more than one staff meeting to go through all 6 of those, so breaking that down, which one are we going to focus on first? As it says, they're revisiting kind of previous training on some of this that you'll have already done. The motivating teachers element is, how do we motivate teachers with this learning and wanting to learn about these things, and how to present it, and those kind of things, which kind of builds into that kind of not overloading and things like that as well. Then in terms of developing teacher techniques, so how do we take that theory, go back to that slide at the beginning, how do we take that theory and that teacher expertise to become evidence-informed practice? How do we do that? And there's some mechanisms there to help think about that. And then finally, that kind of, as we all know, often we do lots of knowledge giving and discussions and sharing knowledge, which is obviously part of professional development, but forget to do how do we embed that into practice, which is that ongoing incremental or instructional coaching, kind of the mentoring, working with ECTs or in schools, monitoring and all of those kind of things. How as a school are we planning to do that so that this doesn't just go by the wayside? We don't just do an inset day in September about it all and then nothing more, and then it just kind of fades into one of those things that people just think, oh well, let's not bother, we don't need to worry about it. So useful there to kind of think about kind of how to then take what we've talked about and where to start, what to do, how to plan that as a school, depending on your need and using your professional expertise. And then finally, within that as well, there's the implementation work, which is great. And part of that might be, at the moment, having watched this video, might be to go and explore some of these things. So scaffolding, for example, it's that time to go and explore how scaffolding looks across the school, or thinking about the use of some of the knowledge organisers, or whatever it happens to be, doing that exploration, because it might be that your staff are already modelling brilliantly well, and actually that's not the bit to focus on, but we want to particularly focus on this. So that exploration phase, building into okay, so this is what we know about our school and what we need to focus on. This is what we're going to do. Here's our plan for the next year or next couple of years of how we're going to work through this. Then thinking about the kind of the delivery of that, how we're going to do that, and then the sustaining of that so that it continues. So I won't go into more detail now, but those of you that are aware of the implementation guidance, this is the bit of metacognition and self-regulation, is the kind of knowledge. So how do we kind of implement that? That's where that guidance report is most helpful. Okay, so just as we sort of wrap up here, then hopefully there's been some new learning for you, and if we've only just touched on it, there's the evidence briefing is there, the guidance report is there to go into that in more detail. So do more of that. Hopefully it's we've given you a chance to think about kind of some key reflections and some next steps that you've got. Karen, do you want to just do the final wrap up of that as well?
Yes, thank you. And then I say, it's just think about that key small thing that you might want to focus on, because there was a lot there in your schools. And the final thing I wanted to do was just highlight, there's so much out there, some of the tools that there. So when you go onto the Metacognition and Self-Regulated Learning website, there are so many tools and useful resources that you can download, including sort of the 7-step model, a school audit tool so you can see where you are. Just to some of the really useful videos out there, which I'll just flick through just to explain, that can be useful in staff meetings. And as I said, lots of useful tools here, which we'll add, but I've also put at the end here. So just to finally go back to say thank you very much for joining us for our evidence briefing. We really hope they've been useful. We've enjoyed making them. If you ever need anything, please do get in contact with us, and we're there to support you in any way that we can. And we've got our new evidence briefings ready for our next academic year, which we've got really more of a literacy focus, haven't we? And then we'll be looking at maths and things like that.
Yeah, so yeah, as Karen said, been great this year, and hopefully it's been really helpful and useful, and see you next year for our evidence briefings.
Thank you.